The numbers in the tropical Pacific Ocean no longer add up. We have just pushed past the extreme 2.0 degree anomaly mark, birthing a Super El Niño that is actively tearing the North American weather pattern in two. Right now, half the continent is baking under a stalled, grid-crippling heat dome, while the other half is drowning under relentless flash floods. I am going to show you exactly what is driving this dual-front continental emergency, and why forecasters are quietly warning that the most dangerous phase of this disaster is just beginning. When you look at the raw meteorological data coming out of the National Weather Service this week, it does not look like a standard summer forecast. It looks like the mathematics of a system that is fundamentally breaking apart. We are currently watching a systemic escalation, a two-front war being waged by the atmosphere against the geography and the built infrastructure of the North American continent. To understand the sheer scale of the crisis, we must forensically examine both fronts. Front one is the heat dome, currently parked over the western United States and expanding aggressively across the Central Plains. This is not simply a period of unusually warm weather, and to treat it as such is a catastrophic miscalculation. When we see surface temperatures consistently pushing past the 105 degree Fahrenheit threshold day after day, week after week, we are no longer looking at meteorology. We are looking at thermodynamics operating at a lethal continental scale. At 105 degrees, the physical environment begins to aggressively degrade. The atmosphere becomes a massive, invisible sponge, extracting every available microscopic drop of moisture from the topsoil, the vegetation, and the concrete infrastructure of our cities. This extreme heat triggers a devastating feedback loop driven by the ratio of sensible heat to latent heat. To grasp why the West is baking so violently, you have to understand the arithmetic of the soil. Under normal summer conditions, when the sun's intense solar radiation hits the Earth, a massive portion of that incoming thermal energy is used to evaporate moisture from the dirt and the leaves of plants. This process, known as latent heat transfer, acts as the planet's natural air conditioning. Because the energy is consumed in changing the physical state of the water from a liquid to a gas, it does not significantly raise the temperature of the air. But as this high-pressure dome sits in place, the immense weight of the sinking air compresses and heats the lower atmosphere, completely clearing the sky of protective cloud cover. The sun hammers the ground relentlessly. The soil completely dries out. The evaporative cooling engine stalls. With zero moisture left to evaporate, 100% of the incoming solar radiation is converted into sensible heat. Pure, unadulterated thermal energy that goes directly into heating the air molecules. The drier the ground gets, the hotter the air gets. The hotter the air gets, the more deeply it desiccates whatever microscopic moisture is left deep in the bedrock. The math becomes a runaway loop. The heat dome literally locks itself into the geography, feeding on the drought it creates, and effectively flash-baking the western half of the continent. Asphalt begins to buckle. Rail lines warp under the thermal expansion. The deep roots of ancient forests surrender their water to the atmosphere, turning millions of acres of timber into a continent-sized powder keg waiting for a single spark. But the atmosphere is a closed fluid system. When you build a mountain of dense, superheated, high-pressure air in the west, you violently displace the atmospheric energy into the east. The laws of fluid dynamics demand balance, and that balance is exacted with devastating force. This brings us to the second front of this continental emergency. If you shift your focus to the east coast, the telemetry paints an entirely different, but equally destructive, picture. Right now, there are active high-level National Weather Service flood watches blanketing the southeast, specifically targeting areas like North Georgia, the Carolinas, and stretching violently up into the mid-Atlantic. The eastern half of the country is not experiencing heat. It is drowning. This is the direct mechanical result of a phenomenon known as the Ring of Fire. Because the central heat dome is so massive and so physically dense, incoming weather systems cannot penetrate it. It acts like an invisible, atmospheric concrete wall extending 30,000 feet into the stratosphere. The jet stream, the fast-moving river of upper-level air that normally carries storms safely from west to east across the continent, hits this mountain of high pressure and is forced to divert. The high-speed winds are pushed violently up and over the top of the dome in the northern states, and then they plunge almost vertically down the eastern edge of the dome, slicing straight through the southeast. This eastern edge is the Ring of Fire. It acts as an atmospheric racetrack. As the air plunges south, it collides with incredibly rich, moisture-laden air pumping inland from the abnormally warm Gulf of Mexico and the western Atlantic Ocean. The collision of the fast-moving, cooler air aloft with the supersaturated, boiling tropical air at the surface creates explosive atmospheric instability. The air is forced to rise at terrifying speeds, condensing billions of gallons of water vapor into towering, 50,000-foot-tall cumulonimbus clouds. But the true, catastrophic danger of the Ring of Fire is not just that it creates severe thunderstorms. The ultimate danger is that the steering currents are completely locked in place by the unmoving heat dome. The track does not change. Therefore, the storms do not move east and clear out into the ocean. They form, they mature, they dump their water, and they track over the exact same geographical footprint, hour after hour, day after day. Meteorologists call this training. It is the atmospheric equivalent of a massive freight train, where every individual thunderstorm is a separate 1,000-ton rail car rolling over the exact same piece of track. In places like North Georgia and the Carolinas, this relentless training of severe storms is delivering catastrophic volumes of water to a landscape that physically cannot absorb it. When you analyze the hydrology of the Southeast, you realize how quickly the math turns lethal. The soil in regions like the Piedmont of North Georgia is heavily composed of dense, compacted, iron-rich clay, specifically a soil order known as ultisols. Clay has a highly restrictive infiltration rate. Because the soil particles are so microscopically small and tightly packed, there is virtually no pore space for water to enter. It can only absorb a tiny fraction of an inch of water per hour. When a training thunderstorm complex drops 3 to 4 inches of rain in a frantic 90-minute window, the clay ground instantly fails to absorb it. The soil reaches total saturation in minutes. Every subsequent drop of water immediately becomes surface runoff. In our heavily urbanized and suburbanized eastern corridors, we have made this geological reality exponentially worse. We have paved over the natural, undulating topography with thousands of square miles of completely impermeable concrete, asphalt, and roofing materials. The water cannot sink in, so it seeks the path of least resistance, channeling with terrifying speed into small creeks, concrete drainage ditches, and suburban culverts. The volume of water moving through these artificial channels is staggering. A single inch of rain falling over 1 square mile equals roughly 17.3 million gallons of water. When 4 inches fall over a suburban grid in 2 hours, the drainage infrastructure, which was engineered using rainfall estimates from the 1970s, is instantly obliterated. Within minutes, a dry, concrete-lined creek bed transforms into a raging, turbulent river carrying thousands of tons of hydraulic force. The flash floods currently plaguing the East Coast are not random, unavoidable acts of nature. They are the highly predictable, mathematically certain outcome of a locked ring of fire pattern dropping tropical moisture onto saturated, impermeable ground. We have a continent actively tearing itself apart. The West is baking into a hyper-arid, lifeless desert, and the East is being hammered by relentless, localized deluges. But while the raw temperature highs and the footage of flooded highways dominate the visual imagery of this crisis, they are actively masking the true silent killer of this event. When forensic pathologists and epidemiologists study mass casualty heat events, they do not look at the afternoon high. The 105-degree reading at 3 p.m. is dangerous, but it is not what fills the morgues. The true investigators look at two specific, interconnected metrics: the wet bulb temperature and the catastrophic lack of overnight cooling. The wet bulb temperature is a metric that combines raw, sensible heat with atmospheric humidity to measure the exact point at which the human body mathematically loses the ability to cool itself. The human cardiovascular system is, at its core, a highly advanced biological engine. Like any engine, it generates heat, and it relies on a cooling system to shed that heat. For humans, that system is the evaporation of sweat, when the ambient air is heavily saturated with moisture, when the humidity climbs in tandem with the heat. The atmosphere simply cannot accept any more water vapor. The evaporation process slows to a halt. The sweat simply pools on the skin, hot and useless. The biological cooling engine fails. Inside the brain, the hypothalamus, the biological thermostat, panics. It senses the core temperature rising toward the lethal 104-degree mark. At this temperature, the proteins in the human body begin to denature, and the cells begin to physically break down. In a desperate, failing attempt to radiate heat, the hypothalamus commands the heart to pump massive volumes of blood away from the internal organs and out to the surface of the skin. The heart rate skyrockets. Blood pressure fluctuates wildly. The blood itself begins to thicken as dehydration sets in, increasing the viscosity and forcing the heart to work exponentially harder just to push the sludge through the veins. This cardiovascular strain is silent, it is rapid, and if the environment does not change, it is absolutely lethal. But the healthy human body is resilient. It can survive a high wet bulb temperature in the afternoon, provided it receives a critical required recovery window at night. Under normal summer conditions, the sun sets, the ambient temperature drops into the upper 60s or low 70s, and the human body sheds its accumulated thermal stress. The heart rate normalizes. The blood retreats from the skin back to the vital organs. The biological engine resets. This brings us to the most dangerous, terrifying data point on the current forecast models. The overnight lows are not dropping. Across massive swaths of the continent, the ambient air temperature at 3 a.m. is refusing to fall below 80 degrees Fahrenheit. In heavily concreted urban centers, the urban heat island effect means the concrete buildings and asphalt roads absorb the 105-degree heat all day and slowly radiate it back into the air all night. The city essentially becomes a massive thermal oven. When the nights stay hot, the human body never resets. The The thermal stress compounds day after day, subtly pushing vulnerable populations, the elderly, the chronically ill, and those trapped without adequate shelter or air conditioning, into irreversible systemic failure. It is a slow, agonizing physiological collapse that happens entirely behind closed doors. And it is this exact lack of overnight cooling that is currently pushing our electrical infrastructure to the absolute brink of total catastrophic collapse. To understand exactly how close the North American power grid is to failing, you have to stop looking at the macroscopic map of the United States and look at the microscopic physical reality of the hardware that keeps our modern civilization alive. I want you to picture a single, cylindrical, gray metal step-down transformer sitting high on a wooden utility pole in a densely packed residential neighborhood. It is 3 a.m., under normal historical climatic conditions. This is the time when the transformer rests. The neighborhood sleeps, televisions are off, appliances are dormant, the overall power load drops to its absolute minimum, and the cool night air allows the heavy metal core of the transformer to shed the intense latent heat it generated during the peak afternoon draw. But tonight is not normal. The outside air is perfectly stagnant, thick with humidity, and sitting at a suffocating 83 degrees Fahrenheit, and the neighborhood is definitely not sleeping. Because the houses have been baking in 105-degree heat for 12 straight hours, every single central air conditioning unit and window unit on the block is running at absolute maximum capacity. They are drawing a massive, continuous, unrelenting current of electricity through the lines just to keep the indoor temperature survivable. Inside that gray metal cylinder, an invisible, highly volatile thermodynamic crisis is unfolding. The transformer is not a magic box. It is a physical machine with physical limits. It is essentially a massive, heavy coil of copper wire wrapped in specialized, highly engineered cellulose paper, all completely submerged in a bath of highly refined mineral oil. Its job is to take the high-voltage electricity coming from the regional substation and step it down to the lower voltage that can safely enter a residential home, as the massive, relentless electrical current is pulled through the copper wire by the desperate demand of the neighborhood's air conditioners. The physical resistance of the copper generates extreme heat. This is an unavoidable law of physics. Normally, the mineral oil absorbs this heat and circulates it to the outer metal casing, where the cool night air carries it away. But because the outside air is 83 degrees, the thermal gradient is broken. The mineral oil cannot effectively radiate the heat away. The temperature of the oil begins to steadily, unstoppably climb. As the internal temperature crosses 180 degrees, the laws of physics begin to actively, aggressively fight the hardware. When copper heats up, its electrical resistance increases. Because the resistance increases, the electrons moving through the wire scatter, meaning it takes more effort to push the exact same amount of electricity through the line. This increased effort generates even more heat. It is a silent, escalating thermal runaway. Inside the transformer, the mineral oil is now boiling. The intense circulating heat begins to chemically degrade the cellulose paper insulating the copper coils. The chemical bonds of the paper begin to physically break down. It becomes brittle. It begins to carbonize and turn black at 3:15 a.m. under the relentless, crushing, unending load of the neighborhood's cooling demand. The degraded paper insulation finally cracks. The raw, high-voltage electricity instantly arcs across the microscopic gap. This electrical arc superheats the boiling mineral oil to thousands of degrees in a fraction of a millisecond, instantly vaporizing it into a highly combustible, expansive gas. The pressure inside the sealed metal cylinder spikes exponentially. The heavy metal casing physically expands, distorts, and then, unable to contain the pressure, it violently ruptures. A loud, echoing, concussive pop rings out across the quiet neighborhood, sounding like a shotgun blast. A shower of brilliant blue sparks and burning oil rains down onto the pavement below. The low, steady hum of the air conditioners abruptly stops. The neighborhood goes completely dark. This is not a theoretical worst-case scenario. This hyper-localized mechanical failure is currently playing out, pole by pole, block by block, substation by substation, across the entire country. The hardware was built and engineered in the 1970s and 1980s for a climate that simply no longer exists, and when multiple transformers fail, or when a massive, high-voltage regional transmission line sags into the trees because the heat has caused the metal cables to physically expand and stretch, the regional grid operators sitting in sterile, windowless control rooms are forced to make a terrible mathematical choice. They watch the telemetry on their screens. They see the voltage dropping dangerously low across the grid. If the voltage drops too far, the entire interconnected regional grid will experience a catastrophic cascading blackout, a massive, uncontrolled failure that damages power plants and takes weeks to physically restart from a dead stop. To prevent the entire grid from committing suicide, the operators must intentionally, deliberately cut the power to hundreds of thousands of homes. They must initiate rolling blackouts. They type a command into a computer, and entire zip codes go dark. When rolling blackouts intersect with 80-degree overnight lows and 105-degree afternoon highs, the silent killer is unleashed at scale. Imagine the interior of a fourth floor, a concrete apartment building when the power is cut at 3:15 a.m. Without the artificial life support of air conditioning, the concrete architecture, which has been absorbing solar radiation all day, begins to radiate that heat inward. The apartment becomes a slow cooker. The windows do not open wide enough to provide a cross breeze. The air is entirely still. The biological clock of the people trapped inside immediately starts ticking. The hypothalamus panics. The heart rate spikes, the sweat pools, and the ambient temperature simply continues to climb. The architecture that was designed to protect us becomes the very mechanism that traps the heat, accelerating the biological failure of the people inside. This is how the infrastructure failure directly translates into a mass casualty medical emergency. If this is the cascading effect, the heat dome, the training floods, the biological failure, and the grid collapse, then what exactly is the underlying cause? Why is the atmosphere behaving with such unyielding static violence? To answer that, we must zoom out from the exploding transformers and the flooded culverts and look at the core physics of the Pacific Ocean. The atmosphere does not act independently. It is entirely a slave to the oceans. The oceans cover 71% of the Earth's surface and contain over 90% of the Earth's total climate energy. The atmosphere is just a thin, reactive layer of gas sitting on top of this massive thermal engine. When the ocean moves, when the ocean heats up, the atmosphere simply, violently reacts. Right now, a massive, wildly anomalous pool of boiling water has formed in the equatorial Pacific Ocean. This is the Super El Niño. But to understand how a patch of warm water in the middle of the Pacific dictates the flash flooding in North Georgia and the exploding transformers in the Central Plains, we must visualize the intricate mechanics of fluid dynamics, latent heat transfer, and planetary waves. The heat in the ocean does not stay in the ocean. Through the continuous massive process of evaporation, the boiling Pacific Ocean transfers millions of tons of superheated water vapor directly into the atmosphere above it. As this hot, moist, incredibly buoyant air rises deep into the upper troposphere, it physically expands. This massive expansion of tropical air effectively forces the entire height of the atmosphere to bulge upward and outward. It disrupts the normal circulatory flow of the Earth's atmosphere, a system known as the Walker circulation, and sends a massive shockwave of kinetic and thermal energy rippling northward across the northern hemisphere. This shockwave brutally disrupts the jet stream. Think of the jet stream as a fast, shallow, rapidly flowing river of air circulating the upper latitudes of the planet. Under normal conditions, the water flows relatively straight, with gentle moving curves. But the massive thermal expansion from the Pacific El Niño has essentially dropped a gargantuan, invisible atmospheric boulder directly into the middle of that fast-moving river. That atmospheric boulder is the massive high-pressure ridge, the heat dome, that is currently parked over the west. When a fast-moving river hits a massive boulder, the water does not simply stop. It violently washes around the edges. It creates standing waves, deep, plunging eddies, and turbulent, chaotic downstream currents. This is exactly what the jet stream is doing. It is hitting the atmospheric boulder of the heat dome, deflecting violently to the north into Canada, or then cascading steeply down the eastern edge, carving the deep, persistent trough that is fueling the ring of fire. The weather pattern is not broken. It is not acting randomly. It is performing exactly as the strict laws of fluid dynamics dictate when an anomalous, massive thermal object is introduced into the flow. The jet stream is locked in a deeply amplified, highly distorted Rossby wave pattern. Because the amplitude of the wave is so deep, the forward momentum of the jet stream stalls. The weather stops moving west to east. It locks in place, and it will not return to a normal, flat flow until the atmospheric boulder is removed. But the boulder is not going anywhere. If we look closely at the recent, highly scrutinized data published by the UN World Meteorological Organization, the forensic reality of our situation becomes absolutely undeniable. The fleets of ocean buoys and satellites deployed across the Pacific confirm that the sea surface temperatures in the critical Niño 3.4 monitoring region have officially crossed the extreme 2.0 degrees Celsius anomaly threshold. This is not a minor fluctuation. This is the strict mathematical definition of a Super El Niño event. The nuance here, the critical physical detail that changes the entire timeline of this disaster, is the concept of thermal mass. The ocean is not a fast-moving weather front that blows in and blows out. It is a massive planetary-scale thermal battery. Seawater has an incredibly high specific heat capacity, meaning it takes a tremendous amount of sustained solar energy to warm it up, and it takes an equally massive amount of time for it to release that heat and cool down. Because this oceanic thermal battery is fully charged and currently locked at over 2.0 degrees Celsius above the historical baseline, the massive amount of energy feeding the atmospheric boulder is continuous. The shock wave is not a pulse. It is a steady, unrelenting stream of force. This means the resulting heat dome and the ring of fire are not fleeting weather patterns that will blow over by the weekend. They are locked in, semi-permanent geographical features of our summer. This hard, undeniable oceanographic data brings us to a viral, deeply frustrating misconception that is actively putting people in danger by minimizing the threat. If you spend any time looking at the public discourse surrounding this weather event, you will inevitably encounter the myth that El Niño is strictly a winter phenomenon. There is a widespread, fundamentally flawed narrative, often pushed by those who do not understand atmospheric physics, that El Niño only matters for the California snowpack in January, and that it has absolutely nothing to do with the suffocating summer heat in July. This is an illusion born from historical averages. When it completely falls apart when subjected to basic thermodynamics, the ocean does not own a calendar. Thermodynamics do not wait for December. When millions of square miles of Pacific Ocean water spike by 2.0 degrees Celsius in the middle of the summer, the transfer of latent heat into the atmosphere is instantaneous. The atmosphere does not put the energy on hold. It responds immediately, violently, to the energy it is given. The violent, grid-testing heat dome expanding aggressively across the continent right now, and the relentless, training flash floods tearing apart the East Coast are the direct, undeniable physical proof of this energy transfer. To dismiss this catastrophic event as unconnected to El Niño simply because of the month on the calendar is to willfully ignore the fundamental laws of energy conservation. The heat is in the water right now. The energy is in the sky right now, and the infrastructure is failing right now. The math does not care what month it is. So, with the physics established and the mechanics locked in place, what is the concrete timeline, and exactly who remains in the crosshairs? Looking at the predictive supercomputer models and the unrelenting persistence of the upper-level ridge, we are staring down a concrete, unyielding timeline. For the next 7 to 10 days, stretching deep into early August, the atmospheric boulder is not forecast to break, weaken, or move. If you live in the Central Plains, the desert Southwest, or the deep interior of the West Coast, you remain squarely in the highest probability zone for localized grid failure and rolling blackouts. The overnight lows will not offer your local power grid the thermal relief it requires to reset. The thermal degradation of the utility hardware will compound. The mineral oil in the transformers will continue to boil. You must prepare for the mathematical certainty that the power may fail when you need it most, and you must have a plan to cool your body when the air conditioning stops. If you live along the East Coast, from the Mid-Atlantic down through the Carolinas and into the Southeast, you remain firmly locked in the downstream, turbulent eddy of the jet stream. The ring of fire will continue to dictate your daily reality. The clay soil is already at maximum saturation. The urban runoff systems are already overwhelmed and structurally compromised. You must treat every incoming severe thunderstorm warning as a potential catastrophic flash flood event. Because the ground can no longer absorb the mathematics of the incoming rainfall, we are currently witnessing the sheer, terrifying power of the global oceans dictating the absolute survival limits of our terrestrial infrastructure. We have built our cities, our power grids, our drainage systems, and our very way of life based on a 20th century baseline of climate stability. We assumed the limits of the sky were fixed, but the Pacific Ocean has just violently altered the baseline. The math has permanently changed, the grid is fragile, and the atmosphere is entirely unforgiving. Evaluate your local geographic risks. Check on the vulnerable people in your neighborhood who cannot survive an 80-degree night without the artificial life support of the power grid. And remain highly vigilant over the next 10 days as the atmosphere continues its assault. Subscribe for continuing forensic updates as we track the limits of this continental emergency. Stay safe and respect the math.